This picture comes from 2015. I'm sure we all remember back in April 2015, there was a man named Freddie Gray who died while in police custody, and shortly after he passed away, peaceful protests kind of eventually melded with violent uprisings, and Baltimore became national news for a few days, and pictures such as this came out of that, right? So just look at that picture, just kind of take a little temperature. Like, how does it make you feel? How do you react? Are you angry? Are you confused? Or do you feel judgmental of one or the other? Okay, just kind of think of that and kind of tuck that away in your brain. At the end, we're going to come back to this picture, and I hope at the very least that this picture will at least make sense, regardless of how you feel about it. That is my goal today. I'm going to pass around something that's going to strike fear into some of your hearts, but I promise you it's not going to be that bad. I'm going to hand you a stack of cards. I'm going to ask you to take the card off the top and that you pass this card around so everybody in the room has a card. This is your literal race card. This is a participatory workshop. Now, I want to explain what that does not mean. It does not mean at any point that you're going to be asked to act like or what you think the particular card says or speak like or anything. So you're not going to be acting out during this participatory workshop. But here's what that means. The reason I had you all move here is right now this is Baltimore City, kind of circa 1900, okay? And we're all living in it. And some of us are black and some of us are white. About half of this room, if the cards play out right, will be white and black. That doesn't perfectly match the demographics of the time, but as history moves, some of you are going to move as well to demonstrate what happens in history. Does that make sense? And that's why I had you all move very close, but some of you will be moving outwards as things change. So first, I should just say who I am, because you're probably like, who is this guy? So I have a PhD from UMBC in language, literacy, and culture, just an interdisciplinary program. And one of the things that came out of it was this project. I'm also a part-time American Studies adjunct professor. I've worked with urban youth for 20 plus years. I've been a high school, middle school, and elementary school teacher. I've been a mentor, and currently I'm a program director for City Springs Elementary Middle School. I didn't know this was going to happen, but City Springs is actually considered like a regional model for restorative practices. So if you're doing restorative practices, you might want to call me up and check out City Springs sometimes. Just so you know, City Springs is kind of right smack dab between Hopkins Hospital and Fells Point. It's going to be significantly redeveloped in the next few years, but I'm going to get to that. And then lastly, I'm a parent of a Baltimore City Public School student. My daughter is about to start second grade at Waverly Elementary Middle, which if you're not from the area, is about a mile east of Hopkins Homewood. So I say that because I have some skin in the game. I know you're all not doing research on Baltimore, but I care about education because it directly impacts me and my family. And I think part of the reason why I do this is because I want education to be stronger, and research is certainly one part of that. So that is me. Quick story. I want to start with a little anecdote. So as I said, I teach American Studies classes at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, if you're not from around here. And the class I currently teach is called American Music and Culture. And each week, we do a different kind of issue or topic in American music. And one of those weeks, I always spend a whole week talking about the Baltimore music scene because, as many of you may not know, Baltimore is kind of regionally considered one of the kind of coolest music scenes in the country in terms of underground or independent music, right? And as a professor, one thing I do at the beginning of each class is I have my students take a survey to kind of take their temperature about the different topics that are going to be included in the class, right? So one of those survey questions is this. When I hear someone say Baltimore, the first words and images that come to my mind are blank. So you can think about your answer. I won't ask you to share it. Here's kind of a greatest hits list of some of the various answers I've gotten over the years. So kind of take all those in. So there's a lot we could say about this list, right? But the kind of the gem that I want to pull out from this list is that Baltimore, in the minds at least of the people who live near and around it and in it, kind of see the city as kind of like two Baltimores, right? So this is the one Baltimore, Charm City, right? It's one of our nicknames, right? Craft breweries and cool farm-to-table restaurants and touristy areas, right? And then there's Bodymore Murderland, as some have called it. Right? We're one of the only cities in the country whose murder rate is going up instead of down right now, right? And if you haven't found out, these parts of the city often like are literally back to back from each other, right, in certain parts. So why is that? Why is Baltimore so segregated by race and socioeconomics, right? To take that kind of general question, make it more specific, why are the conditions and opportunities in Baltimore so starkly drawn along race and class lines, right? And again, to kind of make it even more specific for you all, how might understanding the history of race in Baltimore help you as an educational researcher in this city, right? And I just want to ask this, why does this matter, right? Most of you probably aren't from here. You probably won't stay here when you're done. And you might be doing urban research, you might not be. So why does this matter for you? Well, I think there's a few reasons. One is you're going to be living here. And the headlines speak for themselves. Baltimore, in terms of kind of its national and even international profile, has a certain reputation that is certainly partially true, but is not the whole story. But regardless of whether it's part of the story or is the story, it demands an explanation. Like, why is it this way, right? Additionally, if you're students at Hopkins, right? And as you may have heard from the previous presentation, some of these race issues right now are being hotly debated on the Hopkins campus, right? With the whole question of should we have a private police force or not, right? And although it doesn't seem exactly about race, it is certainly in the minds of the people who are protesting it. And kind of a third reason, so this is just a map of the country with some of the major cities. If you're not from Baltimore and you don't plan to do research here, and you don't plan to stay here, you're probably from a part of the country that has a city, right? And in that city, there are neighborhoods that we finally call ghettos, right? For better or for worse, for lack of a better term. And while Baltimore's story is unique, kind of the framework I'm going to be giving you, in a lot of ways, tells the story of every American city, right? So again, as Eric said, I hope you can extrapolate from this if you don't intend to look at Baltimore and see how it has relevance for anyone doing research in or near a city in education. So I'm going to ask you this question. I'm going to ask you to take a minute just to discuss it with the people around you. How might having a solid framework for understanding racial issues in Baltimore help you empathize with the issues facing many in this city, whether it's from a personal standpoint or professional research standpoint? How might that be helpful? Take a minute to discuss, and then we'll reconvene. Okay, if you could please wrap up your conversations. I fully realize that was not enough time to discuss this question, but I promised I'd finish by 4, and we have an hour and 15 minutes. All right, so we're going to have some discussion times, but they're going to be relatively brief. I hope you will continue these discussions outside of here. So here's kind of my outline for today, kind of a 5-part outline. We're going to talk about 5 different historical processes that kind of overlap but sort of happen kind of one after the other. So we're going to talk about segregation. We're going to talk about suburbanization, people leaving the city for the suburbs. We're going to talk about deindustrialization, jobs disappearing, right? We're going to talk about mass incarceration, kind of a hot topic now as it should be, one you're probably more familiar with, but I think is important in this overall story. Finally, we're going to talk about gentrification, which in terms of history is the period we're kind of living in still. So that period will be that last part will be kind of short because I don't know how it's going to turn out. But when you add them all up, in kind of my thinking, this kind of helps us explain why Baltimore is the way it is, right? Why we have these 2 Baltimores living right next to each other. Quick disclaimer, and then I'm going to jump in. You'll probably notice the cards, they either say black or they say white, right? And even looking around the room, not all of you probably fit in that binary, right? And I just want to acknowledge that. I know it's problematic, but in terms of the history of Baltimore really until very recent kind of Latino and Hispanic immigration really has been a black-white story. And a lot of the major, there's kind of 5 things that we're going to look at have been very black-white stories. So if you don't fit in that black-white binary, you kind of like suspend disbelief and, you know, I'll bring you in eventually. But for now, we're going to try to kind of like, just imagine what it's like to be that person on your card kind of viewing these different things that we're going to look at together. So let's start with segregation. A term I know we all can define ourselves, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time defining it. But as you all know, shortly after the Civil War, American cities in the South passed these laws known as Jim Crow laws, kind of colloquially, which essentially mandated racial segregation, right? But here's kind of, I think, a different way to think about it. It's a little more helpful in terms of thinking about the direction I want us to go, which is segregation was not just black and white were separate, but it's that white people got what was best and black people got the rest, right? So it was separate but unequal, as we see from this picture, right? It's kind of a famous civil rights era, Jim Crow era picture, right? You have 2 water fountains, one's for white people, one's for black people, separate, clearly unequal, right? And typically when we discuss this history, we focus on, you know, public accommodations, you know, bathrooms, restaurants, schools, that kind of thing. But in terms of the history of what happened in Baltimore, I think a less kind of exciting but probably more important story is the way segregation shaped housing patterns, right? And believe it or not, Baltimore was the first the first city in the country to pass a residential segregation ordinance. So in other words, in 1911, the city council passed this law saying that it was essentially illegal to have, basically illegal to intentionally integrate a neighborhood. So here's what that looked like. You could have white blocks and you could have black blocks, but you couldn't mix, right? So if you're living on a black block, you couldn't sell or rent your house to a white person. If you're living on a white block, you couldn't sell or rent your house to a black person. Does that make sense? Now, interestingly enough, this law only lasted a few years. The Supreme Court struck it down, I believe, in 1917. I forgot to do notes view, so I can't see my notes, so I apologize. But before then, before this law, black and white people generally lived sort of close-ish, still segregated, but not like we have today. So let's just do this. This is our first little kind of low-stakes activity. If you are white, according to your card, if your card says white, if you could stand up, just so we can see where the white people are living. Okay? Okay, thank you. You can sit down. So again, obviously, if you're sitting, you're black, according to your card, right? So as we can see, kind of early 20th century Baltimore, black people and white people were sort of segregated, but they were still kind of living close to each other, right? So the residential housing the residential housing ordinance kind of started to tip the scale in the direction of segregation. So what happens over the next few decades, even after the Supreme Court strikes it down, is that white people start moving out of the center city, right? So this part right here, which was the oldest part of the city. At that time, it was the dirtiest, it was the oldest housing stock, it was the least desirable. Now it's not. Now it's very desirable, but at that time, early 20th century, people didn't want to live there. So white people start moving out and kind of building the city out and basically doing things that force black people to stay in the older parts of the city, right? That's kind of what we see with this map. Now, I'm sure some of you know redlining. This is a redlining map. We haven't gotten there yet. But let's just say that this is a map for now. And the red part, which again now is very desirable, hot property, in the early 20th century, kind of in the 1920s, 30s, was where the vast majority of Baltimore's black population lived, right? And the white people were kind of moving out. So in white people, this includes all kind of ethnicities at that time, right? You know, German, British, Jewish, Italian, Irish start kind of moving out and further away. So this really speeds up kind of after the Great Depression, right? So here's what happened. We all know what happened probably roughly during the Great Depression. I'm just not going to talk about it a lot. But the big kind of federal response to the Great Depression, with all these people out of work, is that FDR and his administration passed something called the New Deal, right? New Deal has all these provisions to help people suffering from poverty and unemployment in various ways. One of the focuses of the New Deal was on housing, right? Because there were just millions and millions of displaced people who just had nowhere to live. And the federal government kind of opens this new agency called the Federal Housing Administration to essentially encourage middle class and working class home ownership. This is really important because in the early 20th century, before all of this stuff gets created, it was very hard to own your own home. Relatively few people did. If you wanted to buy a house, you had to put as much as like 50 to 90% down on the total price of the house, which means most people couldn't own their homes, right? So what the FHA comes along and says, okay, we're going to essentially back bank mortgages. So if they fail, we'll kind of foot the bill, right? And this will allow banks to offer lower mortgages to kind of everyday working people, right? So essentially what happens is the FHA made home ownership affordable for working and middle class people pretty much for the first time in American history, right? But here's the problem, is that before they did that, they sent these, these agents all around the country, went to every major housing market in America, and they said, we want you to assess the housing markets, right? Because we don't want to use federal money to back mortgages that are probably not going to get paid off, and we don't want to get stuck with the bill, right? So they went to every city, and they marked every city in America with 4 different colors. The green area was highly desirable, meaning if you were going to buy a house in a highly desirable neighborhood, you were pretty much guaranteed an FHA-backed mortgage, right? The blue is somewhat desirable, probably in most cases, yes, but not as good as green, right? Yellow were declining areas, okay? So what does that mean? Well, declining means they're next to red areas, which are the areas that you never got a loan if you're trying to buy a house in that area, which again, if you can put 2 and 2 together, was the areas that were largely black, right? And again, I know in my notes, but the language is pretty vicious. There's basically in the official like FHA manuals, it said, there was like undesirable people living in these areas, and we don't want to back their mortgages because it's declining and it's falling apart, and essentially what happens, although it wasn't written that way, was that homeownership becomes a largely white enterprise in the United States during this period.
Racially discriminatory laws across America ensured that poor people of color migrating from the South would be confined to certain parts of the city that we now think of as ghettos.
Very few people know this, but if you go back and you look at how African American housing patterns were established in the 30s and 40s, even as a result of the New Deal, the FHA, which was a Democratic New Deal program to inspire home ownership in the midst of the Depression, did more to create ghettos than any other federal program before or since. Why? Because when they were creating the culture of home ownership in America, they were exclusionary to black people. They put them in the areas that were maybe a little bit economically depressed and subject to heavy rentership. And then they redlined those areas, and they would not write FHA mortgages in those neighborhoods. Once those areas were redlined, that was basically a design for a ghetto.
So that segregation, that kind of puts us in this place in which there's this like decades-long tradition of forcing people of color to live in parts of the city that white people don't want to live in anymore, right? But it doesn't stop there, obviously, because suburbanization only exacerbates this trend. So how would I define suburbanization? Is the migration of urban residents to areas outside the city's borders, right? So in the very early 20th century, I think Baltimore County had maybe 100,000 people living in it, right? By, now it's got like over 1 million, right? So what happens between now and then? It's important to understand, just in case you're curious, that this has been an ongoing process. So much of what is now urban was originally suburban, right? So even like Hopkins Homewood is like somewhere over here that was considered in the suburbs at one point. So these are kind of the different years that the city's boundaries have moved. Of course, 1918 is the final move, and it hasn't moved since then, right? And we're going to find out what happens outside of that border after. So if you're not from here, sorry, okay, I want the little thing to go away. People around here say the county. When they say the county, they're talking about Baltimore County, which is kind of like a donut, like a big top-heavy donut, I guess, that kind of surrounds the city on 3 sides, right? And this is what we're going to kind of look at right now. So just kind of give you some numbers, not some numbers, just some general trends. In 1930, which we're still at kind of now, Baltimore is a mostly white city with a black minority, and Baltimore County is sparsely populated. By 1980, Baltimore is a mostly black city with a majority white population living in Baltimore County. Just full disclosure, I'm from Baltimore County, so I'm not trying to say anything bad about Baltimore County, but we're going to hear that story. So, before World War II, this is what most of Baltimore County looks like, right? There's little kind of what they call like bedroom communities, like some of you might know Catonsville is connected by a streetcar. Towson was a thing back then as well. But for the most part, much of the county was farmland or it was forest, right? Here's what Baltimore County looks like today, right? I'm just curious, by show of hands, raise your hand if you grew up in a suburb, as I did. So roughly half of us. Okay, so this is probably what your suburb that you grew up in probably looks roughly like this from an aerial view. Maybe not, close enough, So here's how that happened. So one of the ways that happened is World War II happens, right? So World War II effectively ends the Depression. We send American soldiers, mostly men, mostly white men, but some black soldiers also, and other colors as well, over to fight. And in 1944, a little bit before the war ends, the federal government passes something called the GI Bill, right? Some historians consider it kind of like the tail end of the New Deal, where it's essentially this kind of, I guess, like a welfare program for returning GIs, right? And basically what that means is if you're a GI, you could get low interest loans for school or for a business or for property or for a house, right? And this was a large part of the reason why we have such a huge American middle class, was because so many GIs are coming home and taking advantage of these programs and building up education and equity for themselves. And surprise, surprise, a lot of these, particularly in terms of, specifically in terms of purchasing houses and whatnot, a lot of these returning GIs are purchasing houses through loans from the GI Bill, kind of via the FHA, right? But if you can put 2 and 2 together, those kind of structurally racist policies hadn't gone anywhere, and a lot of things happened to essentially keep black people out of these suburbs that a lot of people were leaving the city, particularly GIs, to live in. So let's put all this together. So first of all, if you were a black soldier, you generally could not access the GI Bill. It was not written to the law didn't say that, but in terms of how it was administrated, the federal government left it up to the states to administrate it, and most states kind of across the board just did not offer benefits to returning black GIs, right? They just didn't allow them to. Additionally, even if you wanted to move out to the suburbs and you were non-white, you literally could not in many cases, right? Because they had something known as housing covenants. A lot of suburban communities still have these, right? If you buy a house, you have to like sign this document that says, I promise to mow my lawn, I promise to take my trash out, I promise I won't have, raised chickens. Remember, this is still the early 20th century, so people did things like that. And I promise I won't sell my house to a black person, right? I mean, essentially, if you read it, it's like almost verbatim. That's what it says. You will not, it will not be rented or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. Now, housing covenants were struck down by the Supreme Court in 1946, but many jurisdictions in Baltimore and beyond continued to enforce them, right? Even though it was illegal, and they really didn't stop being enforced until pretty much the 60s. In addition to that, you had this growing culture of fear that was kind of shaping housing markets all across the country. So one of the practices that was really big in places like West Baltimore, if you know the area, like Edmondson Village. So Edmondson Village is kind of northwest of here. Used to be an all-white community, and then it was mostly Jewish, and then it was mostly black. So how'd that happen? One of the ways it would happen is, and it was both black and white real estate agents who did this. A real estate agent would buy a house on a white block. They'd move in a black family. Sometimes it was a fake black family that was like dysfunctional. And then would knock on all the doors on the block and say, hey, there goes the neighborhood. You better get going while the getting's good. And they'd buy up entire blocks in like months or a year and flip that whole block from black to white within a year or two or three. And then whole neighborhoods flip from black to white in a year or two or three, right? So where are all these people going? Well, they're going to the suburbs, right? All the white people and eventually Jewish people going to the suburbs, which for all these reasons that we just talked about were largely closed to black people leaving to them as well, right? So this is why historians call suburbanization white flight sometimes, right? Because it was not just people are leaving the cities, it's that white people are leaving the cities, and they're leaving behind them this kind of tangle of local and national policies that are making it almost impossible for black people to leave the cities as well, right? In addition to that, as we all know, in April 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated, and cities and towns across the country erupt in kind of this racial anger and violence and uprising, which only inflames this process, right? So for a lot of white people, still in Baltimore in 1968, right, they were gone by 1969 or 1970, right? It really inflames those tensions that are already there, regardless of your view on what happened back then. Now, so this is a very grim presentation. I recognize that, but while all of this stuff is going on, right? Black people across the country are mounting resistance, and that resistance is growing and growing and growing, and eventually some kind of like-minded white people join. And by the mid-50s, we have what we kind of call the National Civil Rights Movement, right? And the Civil Rights Movement, if you know your history, had a lot of targets. One of them was all of this racist housing practices that we've been talking about, right? And then in 1968, shortly after Martin Luther King is assassinated, Lyndon Johnson, the president, signs the Civil Rights Act of 1968. It was a pretty comprehensive act that had all these different clauses, but one of them was, I believe, was Title IX, my notes, which essentially outlawed the redlining, it outlawed the housing covenants, it kind of like wipes all this stuff off the books, right? Which was a boon for Baltimore's black middle class, right? And kind of for the first time, after 1970, black middle class people, or just black people who could afford to move, start moving out to the county as well. So everybody look at the city, regardless of where you are, look back at the city. Look at all these empty chairs, right? Now, if you haven't been in Baltimore long, you haven't seen this, but you will. Particularly like neighborhoods like immediately above Hopkins Hospital. There's blocks where there's 40, 50 houses and 2 people living on that block, right? There's some blocks with nobody living on the block, right? That's how this happened, right? Baltimore's a city built for about a little under, actually at its height, Baltimore was built for $1 million. The biggest we ever got was I think 960,000 in the 60s or 70s, right? And right now we're at about 650,000 residents, right? There's a lot of abandoned housing stock. A lot of it's been torn down, but it costs money to tear it all down. So it's not going anywhere anytime soon. It's going to be here, might be here when I die. I don't know. So I'm going to just kind of throw this kind of observation out there of what I see kind of happening on a large scale. Then we're going to stop and talk a little bit. So you have the kind of this cycle happening in the 50s and 60s. And in some neighborhoods, the cycle hasn't stopped. You have conditions causing flight, right? People are leaving. Maybe the conditions are, I'm white and I want to live in the suburbs. Maybe the conditions are, I'm white, I don't want to live near black people. Maybe the conditions are, I'm black middle class, so I finally get to afford, I can finally leave, right? Maybe the conditions can be anything, but people are leaving. People are leaving in huge numbers. As people are leaving, community resources are decreasing, right? So by that I mean tax base. By that I mean leadership, right? By that I mean just emotional attachments to the city. So my father is almost 80. Both my parents grew up in kind of northeast Baltimore. And like not sarcastically, my dad once said, my childhood was like happy days, right? And now if you ask him what he feels about the city, he has a completely different view of it, right? So you have a whole generation of white people who grew up in the city. They see what's happening around them. They leave, and then they hate the city, and then they elect people who put in policies that are punitive to the city, right? That's still happening today, right? So community resources are decreasing, which makes these neighborhoods worse, right? Which makes more people leave, which makes the resources decrease, which makes things worse, which makes more people leave. And there are some neighborhoods, including the one that my school is in, including Sandtown, which is the West Baltimore neighborhood that Freddie Gray grew up in, where this cycle hasn't stopped, right? Anyone who can afford to leave, not anyone, but almost everyone who can afford to leave these neighborhoods does leave, right? And typically the people who do leave are the people who are more likely to be leaders in that community, who are more likely to be stable, and as they leave, things get worse and the cycle continues, right? So that is why certain Baltimore neighborhoods are the way they are. Let's stop a little bit because I've thrown a lot at you in the past 15 minutes, okay? So look around the room. See how Baltimore has changed since the beginning of the talk. And how do you think the following groups felt about the changes? Here's where we're going to kind of like try to inhabit perhaps the little card that you have, right? I'm going to put up 4 very broad demographics. And I want you to spend like a good 2-3 minutes, just pick 1 or 2, and just kind of talk about how these different identity positions are maybe viewing the changes happening in Baltimore over the 20th century. 3 minutes, go. Okay, can we wrap up our conversations? So I think we have time. I would like to hear from you all. Can I hear like 4 different people? If you could just share something your group talked about. And we have a mic. So 4 people to share. One. Start with one. One person to share what your group talked about. Anybody? Thank you.
There's nobody else. All right. Okay, we're here in the inner city, and we have moved on up, and we got some better housing in the neighborhood here as the middle-class black folks. And one of the things we talked about is that in many cases, if you are an up-and-coming middle-class minority and you move into the desirable neighborhood, you don't want that neighborhood to suddenly become minority again, because having the non-minorities there is validating you. And if they leave, you are now being kind of left behind again.
Excellent, thank you. Anybody else? Yes, all the way in the back. By the way, when I teach college courses, I let the last person who go pick who goes next, but we won't do that.
So we are all basically some middle-class white people who have blue-collar jobs, and we've been able to move out to the outer reaches of the county over here. And so we're pretty pleased with the developments in life because we've been able to relocate ourselves here. And we were talking a little bit about how we might think that some of the other groups in the activity might feel. And one of the things we were mentioning is that many times it seems as though people who are left behind in the city sometimes rather than recognizing that there is now this group out here who is very purposefully through policy and other ways ensuring that we have now turned around to make sure that people can't follow us out here in a variety of ways, and sometimes not recognizing that rather than uniting to kind of work against these policies and work against the things that we may purposefully be doing socially and otherwise, the groups who are left behind, whether it might be white or black, urban poor, then turn against one another. So we were kind of curious to see what those groups are coming up with.
She just threw the gauntlet down. Yeah, right there. Sorry, I know I made you all move all across the room, and now it takes forever to get the mic there. I'm sorry.
Well, I want you to know I'm angry and resentful to every single one of you, except her. because she stayed in the neighborhood, and I can count on her. But you all bailed. You took everything. You took the resources, you took the community, and who cares? What are you doing for me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were just talking about how, when you're in your everyday routine and you're dependent on your community, and then all of a sudden, I noticed the person in front of me and behind me left in the first level of the exercise, but then when I turned around and that whole table was empty, it was just like, where did my community go? I depended on that person to pick up my kid from school, or we could stop by here on the way home from church, and now my people are gone. So just that sense of community and having a group, a support group, just kind of dwindled.
Yeah, all good is it's like your PhD students or something. Yeah. Last one, because we need to wrap up this part.
I also say I feel used. I mean, during the day, you see what traffic is like in Baltimore, so it's pretty bad. So you're good enough to come into the city and take our money and then leave. So why aren't you still here? So it just doesn't feel like the investment is you're making money off of us, but you're not investing back in us.
Yeah, I still feel that way. So. Some of us still feel that way. Good, okay, excellent. Any have like a burning thing they want to add real quick, or are we ready to move on? Okay, one more thing. Yeah, sir. Oh, sorry, yeah, one more. I apologize. I changed my mind at the last minute.
It's not burning, but just to complicate this, so I live in Puerto Rico where in the 1950s and 60s, a governor did the opposite, which is in order to sort of combat this gentrification, not gentrification, they weren't calling it then, but this sort of the flight, if you will. He ceded the lands and titles to the poor, so the barrios became owned by the poor, and then he encouraged sort of co-development of these places. And so what that resulted in is a very mixed map in many ways, and yet you just have higher fences on one side, and you still have all the same problems, even though it's not so clearly as the lines are not so stark, but yet all the lines exist, even if they're largely ideological, metaphorical, and racial, as opposed to literally street maps.
Interesting.
But his whole goal was, the airport named after him, was to not have that happen, and it did in spirit anyway.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I love kind of getting that, non-Baltimore perspective. Okay, we're going to jump into our third part of our kind of five-part thing. But I have to say this real quick, because while all this is going on, there's other forces at work, obviously, right? I'm sure we all are familiar with the Great Migration. But just to kind of give you some numbers, in 1910, if you were black living in America, you probably lived in the rural South. I was having trouble with the word rural. By 1970, if you were black living in America, you probably lived in a city, either north or south, right? So between 1916 and 1970, 6 million people migrated nationwide, right? Some people have said this is the largest human migration in all of history, at least recorded history. They migrated looking for work and to escape racial oppression, right? Unfortunately, many of them, particularly at the tail end of that process, are coming at just the wrong time as we lead into our next section that's going to make sense. So what do I mean by deindustrialization? Deindustrialization is a very fancy way of saying the rapid decline of the nation's productive capacity. So just making stuff, right? Working with your hands to make things or to sell things, right? Another way to put this is the evaporation of working class jobs, right? So in the early 20th century, if your ancestors were, Eastern European or Italian or Irish or whatever, they could come here with almost nothing. They could get a job in a factory. It was brutal work, but after unionization, they could probably in a generation or two move up the class ladder, right? In general, those jobs are disappearing. So where are they going? They're going in four directions. Some of them are going out to the county as companies, as people are moving out, companies are moving out, and some manufacturing firms move out to the county. Many of them are going to countries, to be honest, that don't have human rights laws that we have, managing labor and things like that. They're also getting displaced by mechanization, robots, and strangely enough, for a short period of time at least, they're actually going back to the South, particularly in the 70s, when, you know, corporations in the kind of north realized, like, hey, the southern states are more friendly to, you know, don't like unions as much, and you know, we can make more money down there. So some of them are actually going back south as well. And just to kind of give you an idea of kind of the contrast between early 20th century versus late 20th century, how deindustrialization changed that. So in the early 20th century, your average black neighborhood had poverty, right? Because it had poverty, typically had higher crime rates, particularly was not as nice as the white neighborhoods because of all these complicated reasons, right? But you had, as you kind of pointed out, you had middle class and working class black families often living together, right? Going to church together, going to school together, playing baseball together, right? And you also had a lot of neighborhoods with kind of these downtown areas, right? So if you've been up and down Howard Street with the light rail, well, the light rail's currently not functioning, but Howard Street, like downtown Baltimore was like huge in the 1940s and 50s. This is Sandtown. Again, Sandtown's the neighborhood that Freddie Gray is from. Sandtown had a really bustling Main Street. It was actually one of the hottest spots on the East Coast for jazz in the 1920s and 30s. So here's what that same stretch of street looks like today, right? Looks like this. Not many shops, closed shops. If there are shops, it's, you know, the 5 shops you see in every kind of low-income neighborhood in America, right? You know, hair places, chicken shacks, corner stores, liquor stores, right? And essentially, what that demonstrates is that a lot of the jobs that working class people used to sustain themselves, a lot of the jobs that poor black people from the South are moving up here to get are evaporating. Here's kind of a graph to kind of illustrate that. If you're in the back, you probably can't see this, but this is showing from 1970 to 2005, so it's not recent, but showing the time period we're still in. You have manufacturing jobs plummeting. Where's my little, here it is, right? From 100,000 to, I don't know, probably 25, 30,000, right? You also have trade jobs plummeting. So, you know, Baltimore's port used to be like a major port in the kind of international trade scene. It still is in a very tiny way, but not like it you know, used to be. And again, you know, stevedores and people who built ships and worked on ships, that was a major industry, especially for black people. And all those jobs are kind of evaporating as, you know, shipping containers and machines are kind of taking over those jobs, right? But you do have an increase in service jobs, right? Which is, you know, a job is better than no job in most cases. But by service jobs, of course, as I'm sure you all know, generally speaking, the kinds of jobs that are replacing working class manufacturing and trade jobs are the kinds of jobs, not the kinds of jobs like they were 3 generations ago where you could get them and really pull yourself out of poverty and move from working class to middle class, right? Generally speaking, they're low wage, they're hourly, they're not unionized, they don't offer benefits, health benefits, vacation, right? And generally speaking, people who have those jobs don't move up. Some of them do, but most of them don't, right? And just again, to kind of show you the scale of this, now this is a map showing national trends. This is not unique to Baltimore, but again, to kind of put this in a larger context. So what this is showing is between 1972 and 2008, showing the unemployment rate. The blue line is the national unemployment rate for all people, kind of averaged together. So this is, you know, sometimes the economy's good, sometimes the economy's bad, goes up and down, unemployment rate goes up and down with it, right? But whether the economy's good or bad, the unemployment rate for black people is almost always double what it is for the national average, right? So what does that mean? So first of all, you have neighborhoods like in Baltimore that are highly segregated, right? Highly segregated with very low-income people, with jobs that are increasingly not the kinds of jobs that pull them out of poverty. And you also add to that these neighborhoods are disproportionately being afflicted by unemployment rates that the rest of the country is not experiencing.
In 1950, people in these neighborhoods were poor, but they had jobs. By 1960, we're talking about the jobless poor, because industries had moved out of the inner city, leaving behind concentrated populations of poor people, vulnerable to drug trafficking and all of the other problems associated with joblessness.
And what happens when groups are denied access to the core economic engines in a society? They create their own out of prohibited economies. That was true of the Italians and the Irish and the Jews and everybody else who came to the cities a generation before African Americans arrived.
But I do kind of want to like stop kind of the history lesson and just kind of like think a little bit like what happens when people lose their jobs? Not just people lose their jobs, what happens when whole entire communities are plagued with unemployment in a way that other communities aren't, right? So let's say we got the average black family in like the 1940s or 50s, right? And most of the adults in that community have jobs, right? And the kids see that, right? But then the kids grow up and, you know, in some neighborhoods, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% of the adults, particularly the black men in that community, either can't find work or can't find meaningful work that sustains their families, right? And then that generation has kids. And again, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, maybe even 60% of all the adults, particularly the black males in those communities, can't find jobs. So it's not just that people can't find jobs, it's just you have generations of joblessness, right? So what does that do to people? What does that do to communities? What does that do to attitudes towards work, attitudes towards success, right? Inevitably, it's going to change it. So my favorite sociologist, and you know you're a nerd if you have a favorite sociologist, is William Joyce Wilson. Is anybody familiar with him? Anybody? Okay, 2 people, well, 3, hopefully more of you eventually. So a lot of my ideas from this section come from him, I'll be honest. And I just want to read a quote from this book, When Work Disappears. It was very influential on me. And I just want to read it. I'm going to let it sink in. I'm going to read it again, because I think for me, it has a lot of explanatory power. Crime, family dissolution, welfare dependency, and low levels of social organization are fundamentally a consequence of the disappearance of work. Let me read it again. Just think about it. You might disagree, but think about it. Crime, family dissolution, welfare dependency, and low levels of social organization are fundamentally a consequence of the disappearance of work, right? That for whatever it is about human beings, you know, whether it's like spiritual or evolution or a little bit of both, there's something about labor, about working with your hands, with your minds, with your body, that makes us human, right? I would even say it's a need, it's a human need to do something with your life, right? And when you tie that need to a market that is kind of stacked against you, right? And then huge concentrations of people in these neighborhoods can't access that market and therefore can't meet that need, it changes people, right? So what are some of the things that happen? Well, stuff like this starts to happen, right? There's no functioning economy in a lot of these neighborhoods, so other economies arise that take their place, right? You also have large numbers of people, and we've seen this even as recently with the opioid epidemic, right? It's all happening in Rust Belt cities where the jobs are disappearing, right? As people begin to lose that hope and that sense of worth, they turn to other things that ultimately destroy themselves and their communities and make themselves worse, right? And again, I'm going to pause again really quick before I get back into the history, because I imagine, I don't know, but maybe I'm wrong, but some of you might be thinking this, like, what about culture, right? Like, all this history stuff is nice, and it's interesting, and it's sad, but some people would say, when I drive through the inner city, I see, a bunch of guys standing on the corner, sagging their pants, throwing trash on the ground, cussing and selling drugs, right? And you can talk about this history all you want, but some people would say, those are all cultural issues, right? It's upbringing, it's family transmission, and all this history stuff is fine, but like this is what we should be talking about, right? To kind of put this in a larger framework, right? Anytime you talk about how people turn out the way they do, right? Generally speaking, in America at least, people tend towards like one pole or the other in terms of explaining those, right? So you kind of like the social structure camp, which is obviously where I'm more from, right? People want to talk about economics, policies, education, race, class, gender, identity issues, how those shape how you turn out, right? There's kind of the culture camp, which wants to talk about values, decision-making skills, work ethics, spirituality, right? Individual decisions, that kind of thing, right? And, that was more the world I was raised in, right? So here's what I was told, right? Andy, I was told, there's these people, right? And there's these people. And the only difference between them is that they don't take this seriously, right? This is America. If you work hard, you can make it. And the problem with the people on your right, my left, is that they didn't work hard enough and they just made bad decisions, right? So here's what I was told again, just kind of drive the point home a little further. I was told, get a good education, get a decent job, you buy a home, you move up, and that's the American dream, right? And, legitimately, it worked for me. Like, I have more education than my dad, even though I'm making less, but whatever. I own my own home, right? I made it, right? But again, if you put this in the context of this history that we've looked at, right? The average poor community of color in Baltimore, at least specifically in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, does not have access to a good education, does not have access to a good job, generally speaking does not have access to home ownership because of the lack of a good job, and generally speaking does not have access to these other things, right? So to kind of put all this together, before we jump back into history, is that I would say it structure shapes culture, right? You can't divorce the two, you can't talk about them separately, but you also need to identify which is more powerful in terms of this story. So just really quick. Actually, I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. I think you get it. So By the time we get to the 1970s, we have a situation in which Baltimore City has large populations of mostly black, mostly poor, largely unemployed, not completely, not totally, not even majority in most cases, but very high concentrations of unemployment, right? You have people turning to other things in large numbers to respond to that unemployment, and we respond to it, generally speaking, across the board in the United States in the 70s, 80s, and 90s by locking those people up, right? So the next phase of history is, again, you're probably all familiar with this, but mass incarceration, in terms of its definition, is the rise in extreme rates of imprisonment in the US since the 1970s. And by extreme rates, I mean this. This is the incarceration rate for state and federal prisons from 1920 to 2014. Actually, 1925, it should say. And you notice this huge bump, this huge spike, insane, like quadrupling of the prison population, starting in the 1980s, right? And it goes down a little bit as we get closer to our time, but I mean, the damage has been done. So where does this come from? I mean, part of it is from this, right? As more people are participating in criminal activity, more people are getting locked up, right? That's kind of the simplistic answer. It's partially true, but the fuller answer is more complicated. And a lot of it has to do with what we call the war on drugs, right? So what is the war on drugs? Let me quickly define it, and then I'm going to play a little clip and kind of explain how it led to our prison population exploding. So the war on drugs was essentially a series of laws in this kind of starting really in the late 70s through the mid 90s that kind of increased the amount of legislation going after kind of drugs, right, illegal drugs. There's also increased enforcement of drugs, particularly in cities. There's increased litigation, so just more court cases, right, of people getting prosecuted for drugs, and then higher sentences for drugs. Right, so the war on drugs is kind of this like fourfold assault on kind of all aspects of this illegal activity, right? So how did it lead to this? Well, one of the questions is, so I'm going to, the graphs don't line up perfectly, but I'm going to kind of toggle between two graphs real quick. So we've seen this graph already, but this is that graph kind of split apart by race, right? So the blue line is the white incarceration rate from about 1925 until, 2010, and the red line is the black incarceration rate during that same period, right? Now again, they don't kind of line up on top of each other perfectly, but if you kind of toggle between the two maps, right, a significant portion of this huge jump in incarceration is black people, right? So how did that happen? Well, part of it is that the way the war on drugs plays out has been called, at least by, it's not a fact, it's an opinion, but I think it's an accurate opinion, that the war on drugs really, in some ways, became a war on black people as much as it was a war against illegal drugs, right? So how did that happen? Well, one of the ways that happened is at the very beginning of what we call the drug war, again, started as a series of laws, national federal laws, pieces of legislation that essentially said, you know, police forces across the country, you have these directives to go out there and get the drugs, right? Here's some money, here's some training, here's some new weapons, go out there and get them, right? Now, where did they go? They went here, looking for people that looked like this, right? Now, of course, people across the country do drugs, right? They didn't go to the boardrooms, going after white-collar offenders. They didn't go to the college campuses, going after potheads, right? They went to the people that were the most vulnerable, right, the poorest, right, and locked them up at insane rates. Now, again, just kind of pull out a little bit and further explain things. A lot of the war on drugs had a lot to do with a drug called crack cocaine. Crack cocaine is still around, but I'm sure most of you remember this if you lived through it. But in the mid-'80s, it was a new drug, and it was particularly addictive, particularly destructive, and particularly drove people to do crazy things to get it, right? It also drove a lot of drug gangs, right? So here is the homicide rate during the crack era. It's the black homicide rate and the white homicide rate. So again, just trying to present a balanced perspective, because some people would be critical of what I'm saying. So there were reasons to actually try to intervene, right? Because there's this insane spike in homicide in America's inner cities, largely around drug territories and things like that, right? So, I mean, the crack era was a really intense time. But the way that the legislation was written was highly punitive.
Our society is now infested with drug abusers.
There was a tremendous fear of this epidemic that was going to overcome all of us, not only with drug addiction, but with the violence and terror that was going to come out of this. And tremendous fear led to this view that the criminal laws would save us.
Democrats as well as Republicans got on board to pass a whole new generation of mandatory sentencing laws. These laws raced through Congress in record time. There were virtually no hearings held, no consultation with experts who knew something about drug abuse.
The yeas are 97, the nays are 2.
This is something that had to be dealt with, and of course, you know, election year fever did take hold of some people.
With overwhelming support, Ronald Reagan signed into law an unprecedented array of mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes. But no drug would receive harsher penalties than crack.
The penalties were outrageous. That is, the penalty for crack cocaine was made 100 times more punitive than for powder cocaine.
Acceptance of coke is widespread, commonplace among professionals.
Whites were using powder cocaine in boardrooms in suburban America. Blacks were using crack cocaine in public housing and on the street. And what's the response?
Just wipe me out straight off the map for nothing. 57 years for some small rock. You know what I'm saying? I want to know why I'm being treated like I murdered somebody, you know?
Over time, as the number of blacks in America's prisons for drug crimes skyrocketed, far outpacing the number of whites, many people, including many judges, began to question the disparity in sentencing between crack and powder.
Well, that's the major reason why I've agreed to be interviewed. In my view, it is not fair to have 100-to-1 disparity in the difference between powder cocaine and crack cocaine, and let me explain what that means. A crack defendant with 5 grams of crack cocaine is treated the same as a powder cocaine defendant with 100 times more weight, in other words, 500 grams of powder cocaine. And I don't think most people realize this. What is the difference between powder cocaine and crack cocaine? Do you know? All crack cocaine comes from powder cocaine. The difference is you add baking soda, water, and heat from an oven. That's the only difference.
So this little political cartoon kind of captures that, right? So you have a powder cocaine defendant, right? He's saying, I'm in for 500 grams of powder cocaine, you, right? And this is white under the cocaine defendant, under the powder cocaine defendant, and then the crack cocaine defendants, largely, at least in this political cartoon, all of which are black. They're all saying 5 grams, 5 grams, 5 grams, right? So you have a situation in which poor communities are being over-policed, right? So they're more often being pulled over, stopped, searched for drugs. Obviously, they find more drugs because they're being searched more often. They're being punished much greater, right? And then by the end of the crack era, we have this mass incarceration situation that we're still very much in. So just to put some numbers to it, from 1995 to 2005, kind of right at the end of 1995 is kind of the end of the crack era. So it continues after the crack era. Blacks made up roughly 13% of U.S. drug users, yet accounted for 46% of drug convictions, right? So there's something going on there, right? Many studies show that white and black people in the U.S. sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. So what does that mean? So we can't survey every single drug dealer in the country, right? But if you kind of conglomerate all of the studies that look at how the rates at which white and black people sell drugs, they show that they're roughly the same, right? Additionally, some surveys show white and black people using illegal drugs at about the same rates. Some studies show white people using them at higher rates, right? We just don't know. But either way, the point is, it's not like black people are selling drugs at incredibly higher rates or using drugs at incredibly higher rates, and that's why we're locking them up more. It's not the case. However, despite all that, black people are nearly 4 times as likely as white people to be arrested for drug offenses.
There's a structural problem in the country that we keep ignoring. We have 2 million people in our jails and prisons, and 1 million of them are African American. Most of them are males, many of them for nonviolent drug offenses. That is a pattern that has overwhelmed the African American community because we get a whole generation of kids who now have the assumption that they're destined to be in the criminal justice system. What people need to see today is that the next generation of children right now, with the barriers they face, aren't going to be like I was, or like my parents were, or like my grandparents were, a generation better than those who preceded them.
The police, in many ways, are what I call like the shock troops of mass incarceration. They're the ones on the front line, right? And, there are good cops, amazing, altruistic, self-sacrificing cops, and they're like terrible, evil, horrible cops, and we've had some of those in the news recently, if you've been paying attention, and kind of everything in between, right? And in my understanding, in my estimation, kind of the good, bad, and the ugly are either witting or unwitting kind of pieces in this larger game, right, in which poor black communities are over-policed, over-punished, right, for something that all communities, at least we think, are equally participating in, right? And, you know, is it hardly surprising then that there's this tension, right? So we have the war on drugs kind of becoming literal in the 90s. So in the 90s, there's these series of programs where the Pentagon either sells or gives old military equipment to police forces across the country, and they start looking like this, right? We saw some of that during the Freddie Gray uprisings, right? So is it hardly surprising that we have this bad blood between communities of color and the police? Additionally, a lot of, to this day, police departments are kind of shaped by what we call quota-based policing. So you're a beat cop, and maybe you're on the drug beat, and you're told, okay, you have to stop and frisk or pull over or whatever, search X number of people by the end of the month, right? Where are you going to go? You're going to go to Fells Point? You're going to go to Mount Vernon? No, you're going to go to Perkins Homes, right? You're going to go to the poor black communities and search them to meet your quotas, and then you have increasing tensions between these two communities. And so just to bring this into the whole Black Lives Matter thing, and, you know, and all of that that's been not as talked about now, but was a very hot topic a few years ago. So what this graph is showing, if white, black, Hispanic, and Asian people were the same in terms of numbers, right? So if our populations were equal, kind of 25% for each of the 100%, right? This is the rate at which black people would be killed by the police, right? So sometimes people will say, well, you know, more white people are killed by police than black people. Like, well, that's true, but there's a lot more white people. If the numbers were equal, black people are killed far more often, right? Part of the reason is because the way the policies have been written for decades is that these communities are over-policed, and there's just more police, poor black person interactions in America than there are, generally speaking, for other communities, right? So is this hardly surprising? Is it hardly surprising that communities, so I work in a school, right? And you talk to your average middle school boy, and he'll say, yeah, I hate the police. Duh. It's like saying the sky is blue, right? It's sad, it shouldn't be that way, but it's not surprising. It's not surprising. Is this surprising? You know, people feel all kinds of ways about Black Lives Matter, but is it surprising that we have this movement called Black Lives Matter when we see this long history of not valuing black lives? Is that hardly surprising? Is it hardly surprising that a lot of black people who understand this history feel that the war on drugs is not ultimately about drugs, that it's about controlling and patrolling and policing, over-policing black communities? One more section, and we're going to wrap up in about 10 minutes. And here's where, if you're not in part of this black-white binary that I talked about at the beginning, here's where like a lot of us come in, right? Which is that kind of the fifth phase of Baltimore that we're still very much in is this phase known as gentrification, right? Which I'll just move along and define for us. So gentrification is the redevelopment of urban neighborhoods to lure resource residents to the city. Notice I said resourced. I didn't say white residents. I think it's one of the myths about gentrification is like white people are moving back. Like, no, it's people with resources. Most of them are white because of the history of this country and resource allocation, but it's all kinds of people. Developers rehab old or dilapidated areas into luxury condos, renovated row homes, and or storefronts, right? I'll just give you two examples. Again, if you're new to the city, this is going to mean very little to you. There's an area in kind of northwestish Baltimore called Hampden. Hampden, really interestingly enough, was historically was like West Virginian families moving here to work in like mills along the Jones Falls, which is now mostly covered by concrete. And I lived there right when it was cool to live there, and I felt like I was like invading their space. I really did. Like I did not enjoy living there. Now it's most of the white working class people are gone. There's still some of them there. Most of them are very angry because all of their bars and their corner stores and their local pharmacies have been turned into like cool farm-to-table restaurants and whatnot, right? So the point of this is that gentrification is not white people moving to black neighborhoods all the time. This is like, I don't know, white-on-white gentrification. Can I say that? I don't know. Another example. So my school is right smack dab in the middle of Perkins Homes, which is part of the largest housing project community in Baltimore, I believe. There's a few other projects kind of like smushed together right next to it. And I think they just broke ground in June to slowly redevelop all of those projects into mixed income homes, right? So I don't know if you probably can't see it from where you are, but this is what, where's my pointer? Here it is. This is what my school is going to look like in 6-7 years. But most of the families that are there now are going to be gone. They're going to move out to the county. They're going to move out to other Baltimore neighborhoods, right? And I think it's important to say that of the 5 processes we looked at, this is the only one that probably has some good sides to it, right? It's not all bad. So I think it's important that we talk about that. Let's come back together. So I'm going to share my own list with you and do this. If your group talked about something on the list, you can just snap so as acknowledge that, you know, I divined your thoughts. So one pro is that it raises the tax base, right? Right. More people with money means more taxes, which, you know, depending on your political persuasion, you might hate, but at least it means more money for schools, trash pickup, that kind of thing, right? But the con is a lot of that tax base is kind of undercut by a lot of public funds going to private developers, right? In certain neighborhoods, at least, it ignites the housing market, right? But on the other hand, you have certain situations in which residents are uprooted, right? Either because they can't afford it or they're like, I don't know these people, I'm going to get out of here, right? You have new businesses coming in. It's not a bad thing, but not really related, but I think parallel to that is that you have community history being lost, right? So one of the things I had to learn as like a white middle class guy coming into all these poor communities is you can go to the poorest city in the world and there is leadership there, right? There are people who are leading that community to one degree or another, right? But a lot of times people coming in don't see it that way. They just see problems to be removed, right? You have new leadership, which is not a bad thing, but kind of along the lines of what I just said, you have leadership being devalued, existing leadership being devalued, right? And lastly, you have increased safety, which is not a bad thing, but you also often, sometimes, have increased race and class tensions, again, depending on the situation. I got one more kind of thing to talk about, and actually, this might be helpful for some of you because the previous presentation kept mentioning something that maybe some of you had no idea what they were talking about. And I think actually it kind of dovetails nicely. So remember they were talking about the white owl and the black butterfly? They kind of threw it out there and some of you are probably like, what are they talking about? So as I said, a few years ago, somebody, I forget who the name was, sat down and kind of like drew a kind of Microsoft Paint box around the parts of the city that are mostly white, right? It kind of looks like an L, sort of, right? And then they also looked at kind of demographics as well, kind of on the other side, looking at the black and low income neighborhoods. So the darker the blue, the more low income it is, right? And it kind of makes like butterfly wings, right? So you have to use your imagination, but you can see it, right? Right. And I think the reason I want to end with this is because I think it kind of illustrates both the problem and the peril of gentrification, right? Because here's the thing. As people with resources move back into the city, they want what everyone wants, which is good stuff for their communities and their families, right? Everybody wants that, right? But the problem is the people with resources tend to get that stuff more often, right? So here's an example. I don't know how long this was, maybe 10, 11, 12 years ago. Somebody had this great idea to have, say, let's have like a free bus system, right? Charm City Circulator. It's run by a private company. It's not run by the city, right? And where are we going to put the free bus system? Well, we're going to put it in the neighborhoods where people are most likely to use it, right? We're going to make sure it goes to the touristy sections. We're going to make sure it goes out here to Hopkins, right? But what you have is the people who already have the most resources probably have the most access to transportation, right? Getting additional access to transportation. It's not that poor people don't use it, but in general, most of the people it benefits are not poor, right? Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, actually one of my friends was on this. The city assembled this team of experts and said, hey, we want to make Baltimore more bike-friendly. They didn't do a very good job. That's a little side commentary. So what did they do? They looked at Baltimore's neighborhoods, looked at the demographics. They said, where are people most likely to use bike lanes, right? So these kind of dark areas here are where they put most of the bike lanes for the most part. Where are most of the bike lanes? Well, they're in the neighborhoods that already have the most access to resources. So again, you have resources accumulating in the neighborhoods that already have the most. Sometimes, to help people outside kind of by accident, but not really intentionally, right? One more example, and this is kind of like a private company. There's other two are like more public examples. So I'm sure we all know Zipcar, right? It's a private business where you can rent a car on curbside without having to deal with a human, and you just drop it off at a Zipcar location after you're done with it, right? So when Zipcar, They wanted to be smart, they wanted to make money, they looked at the city and they said, okay, where can we put these zip card locations? Well, we're going to put them in the locations that's going to make them the most money, which is in the areas that already have the most resources, right? And I think that is kind of a perfect example of why gentrification is controversial for the people who it doesn't benefit, because they're the people who need the benefit the most and they often get the least. So let's kind of recap. So we started by talking about segregation, really looking at housing, how that kind of began this pattern of shoving poor black people into the neighborhoods that the people with resources didn't want, right? You had suburbanization, which really clinched this kind of, hopefully not for all time, but at least for now, this city-county thing. We're out here, we're safe, we want you to stay there. It's still very much around, although it's not legal to keep us in here anymore. Deindustrialization, you have the jobs disappearing, you have neighborhoods declining as a result of that, and then you have people frequently turning to things that get them in trouble with the law, which then leads us into the era of mass incarceration, of over-policing, of over-locking up poor black people in Baltimore and beyond. And then finally, you have people with resources moving back into this mess, wanting more resources for themselves and looking around and saying, what's wrong with these people? Why are they acting this way, right? And that's how we got the 2 Baltimores. And hopefully, if you're from other cities, that's how we got the 2 Milwaukees, that's how we got the 2 Detroits, that's how we got the 2 Chicagos, right? Although it doesn't look exactly the same in every city, this framework kind of applies across the board. So to end, I just want to put this picture up again. We started with this picture, remember? This is from the Freddie Gray Uprising in April 2015. Just kind of like take a little check. Does this picture make more sense than it did before? I hope so.